Boldwood presents The Women of Fisher's Wharf, written by Tracy Baines and read by Catherine Harvey. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Great Grimsby, Monday the 29th of April, 1912. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that was enough for Letty Hardy. It had to be, for everything else she loved had been left behind in Lowestoft. Her family, their farm, the wide green fields broken by hedgerows, the sprawling trees, the brook that ran by the lane to the village. She longed for them now, her heart already heavy with doubt at what she'd done. It had been a shock when they had finally arrived at Mariners Row. She had not expected a palace, but had expected more than this. The shabby two-up, two-down dwelling was one of 8, 4 houses on either side of a narrow cobbled yard, their front doors facing each other. At the back, they each had an outhouse, a coal hole, and a scrappy bit of yard. There was an alley between the second and third houses, the walls blackened by soot from the numerous trains that ran along the railway line a few yards away. A long, high wall that divided them from the stables of Dawson's haulage yard closed off the other end. Below it stood the shared pump, the only source of fresh water. Letty tried not to dwell on it as she plumped the feather pillows and ran her hand over the patchwork coverlet, keeping her gaze from the filthy walls of the room, away from the broken window that Alec had patched with a piece of wood taken from a fruit crate that held her small pieces of china. The delicate tea service was a wedding gift from her godmother, and she placed it on the pine chest at the bottom of the bed, a small thing of beauty in the chilled, damp room. Had it only been 1 week that she, 4 days shy of her 20th birthday, had walked down the aisle of the village church to stand beside Alec? Her mother had urged her to wait, but Letty hadn't wanted to, longing to be with Alec, in his arms, in his bed. So soon after his brother's death, her mother had questioned when she'd given her the news of Alec's marriage proposal. They'd courted only 8 short months, and for most of that time, Alec was at sea. His absences filled Letty with a sense of urgency that so much had to be packed into the time he was ashore. There had been plenty of time to reflect on her mother's gentle warnings as they had travelled by train to Grimsby that fresh April morning. Instead of the excitement and anticipation that had carried her through the preparations for their departure, Letty had felt a leaden fear gather in the pit of her stomach as the distance between Lowestoft and their destination grew, and now here she was, and that heaviness remained. The bed made, Alec laid on it and patted the place beside him. Letty pointed to his boots, and he adjusted his legs so that his feet hovered over the bare floorboards. Only then did she come beside him. He lifted his arm, draping it over her shoulder, and pulled her close. Through the open window, they heard coarse shouting, a loud thwack of old hand against young flesh, a child bawling. "Welcome to your new home, Mrs. Hardy." She laughed. They both did. And it was like the cork coming out of a bottle. "Our new home," she corrected. There was time yet to improve it. "No regrets?" he asked. She shook her head in answer, fearing her voice might betray her, glad he couldn't see her face. A swell of sadness rose up inside her, and she pushed away thoughts of the lonely hours that lay ahead. She'd had little time to learn what being a fisherman's wife entailed, her time spent on goodbyes and preparing to travel north to the thriving fishing port of Grimsby on the south bank of the River Humber. Alec had fished out of Lowestoft, as had his father, and his father before him, making a fair living, but not a good one. Sail had given way to steam, and Alec had his eye on the future. He'd come to Grimsby for the deep-sea fishing, for trips that would take him away for weeks at a time, in fair winds and foul, How would she live here without him? He placed his hand under her chin, tilted her face to his, kissed her. His full lips were warm and hard on her mouth, and when she closed her eyes, the shabbiness of their surroundings faded. "Are you done up there?" came a voice from downstairs, and he let her go, sitting up to call out to his mother, "Just finished." He kissed her again, briefly this time, and got up from the bed, pulled her to her feet. "Come on, lass. We'll get a crust to eat, then go out and get some air." She followed him down the narrow staircase, through the small front room and into the kitchen, where her mother-in-law, Dorcas, was standing by the table slicing bread. Her work-roughened hands moved quickly, and her grey eyes briefly flashed at Letty, indicating her disapproval. She was a woman bleached of colour, her long grey hair plaited and wound about her head, dressed in the black of protracted mourning. The loss of her husband Will, 9 years ago, and more recently of her 17-year-old son, Robbie, had robbed her of so much, and the only source of light and colour in her life she gained from Alec. He was 14 when his father was killed in a freak accident at sea, and he'd stepped up to become the man of the family. His father's half-share of the fishing smack, the Stella Maris, had been passed to his sons on his death, and the brothers had learned to handle a ship under the guidance of their Uncle Eric, owner of the remaining share. When Robbie had been washed overboard 9 months ago, Dorcas had sunk into deep depression, and Alec had convinced her that a fresh start would be the healing she needed. Letty had not known her long enough to disagree. Uncle Eric, father of daughters and no sons, was all for selling up and using his share of the sale to buy into a smokehouse. A buyer had been found for the Stella Maris, and Alec had left the sale in his uncle's capable hands on the understanding that Alec's share of the profit would be sent on to them in Grimsby. It had all happened so fast, and Letty had been swept along by Alec's vision of their bright future. Today, excusing her mother-in-law's sourness for tiredness, Letty made for the shelf where she'd placed the preserves her mother had given them from her own stores. She took down a jar of honey, removed the cork stopper, and passed it to Dorcas, who snatched it from her. "We'll need more than honey to sweeten this mucky hole." She banged the jar on the table, making Letty startle. "Now, Mother," Alec soothed. "I wasn't to know, was I?" Dorcas softened slightly. "It's not you, lad. I wasn't blaming you." She stared down at the bread, shook her head. "To think I left my dear cottage for this, my friends, my—" Alec picked up the bread she'd scraped with honey and took a bite, chewing hungrily, sucking at the honey that clung to his fingers. "Now, I wasn't going to leave you behind, was I?" He put his arm about her shoulder. "Rooms in Grimsby are like gold dust, let alone finding a place of our own. We've been lucky." "Lucky, my eye." Dorcas hacked another slice from the loaf. Letty took up a pan of water and set it to boil on the range, and busied herself gathering the brown teapot and mugs from the shelf, pulled a chair away from the table and sat down to eat. "You can look for something better once I'm away at sea." Alec rubbed at his chin, smiled at Letty. She returned it, her comfort brief. Dorcas put down the knife. "Oh, we can we? And how will we pay for that? There'll be nothing in the tin for a while, and I've yet to find braiding work." Alec took another slice of bread. "We can take a bit from the money we get from the sale of the Stella Maris when Uncle Eric sends it on." Dorcas' response was venomous. "That money is not for frittering. It's to be invested in a ship. Your father's legacy." She stuck out her chin. "And Robbie's." Alec was suddenly subdued, and the look of sadness exchanged between mother and son excluded Letty. Their loss was not hers. Dorcas put the stopper back on the jar of honey and, wiping her hands on her apron, took a slice for herself and sat down in the chair opposite Letty. "It would be what your father wanted." Alec agreed, and they continued their small repast in silence. When they were done, the two women cleared away the plates. Letty wrapped the bread in a damp cloth and placed it in the crock, Alex slipping from one side to another as they moved about the cramped space. As Letty came close, he took hold of her hand. "We should go out, get our bearings." "Hey, that would be grand," Dorcas said. "You can show us the Black Prince." Alec stood away from the sink, while Letty shook the crumbs from the damp cloth into the earthenware sink. He shifted uneasily. "I was thinking me and Letty, just so we can spend a little time together before I sail. Is that all right with you, Mother?" He bent forward and kissed her head, as he had kissed Letty's only moments ago, and she looked away. She mustn't be afraid of the love he had for his mother, or hers for him. But didn't she love her own parents as much? And yet there was something about Dorcas's manner that made her feel an intruder, like she had come between them, and that hadn't been her intention at all. Letty quietly took her jacket and hat, and as she fastened it, Alec came over and placed his hand on her back, guiding her towards the door. As he made to open it, Letty caught the bitter expression on Dorcas's face and quickly stepped outside. At the water pump, a gaggle of kids were playing in a tin bath that had become a ship, a broom for a mast, and a scrap of old sheet for a sail. Their feet were bare, their shabby clothing too big or too small. A toddler squatted by a dirty puddle and ran her fingers through it. Letty knew she belonged to Sally Penny, who lived at number 6, in the house opposite the yard to theirs. Her husband was away at sea, and she had 5 children, but that was all she knew of her neighbours. Sally, the only one to make herself known. She gripped Alec's arm. "Perhaps we should ask your mother." "She'll be fine," he reassured her, striding out of the yard. "She's had the pleasure of my company for 23 years. He took her hand. "I want you all to myself. It's only right." He pulled her forward, and she pressed her hand to her hat as they stepped out onto King Edward Street and down towards the docks, the Italianate dock tower rising above the town like a beacon. They hurried across the railway lines and down Fish Dock Road, weaving through the men and women that were going about their work. He pointed out the yard, where he'd stood earlier that morning, hoping to get a ship, his elation that he'd secured a position, even if it was less than he was qualified for. "It's a start, Let, and that's all I need." She nodded, breathless, as his pace quickened the closer they came to the water. On the quayside, she marvelled at the trawlers crammed tightly in the dock, watched as men leaped from one to the other. Seagulls soared high above them, screeching and calling. It was a world away from the farm, from the port of Lowestoft, that was still mainly filled with wood and sail and mast. Sail ships jostled for position here, but they were far outnumbered by those of steam, bows to the dock wall, their funnels belching fumes of black smoke that drifted on the late afternoon air. Alec marched ahead, sidestepping the men that stacked crates and baskets, then stopped abruptly and threw out his hand to introduce the Black Prince. The ship was high in the water, a ladder secured against its bow. "She's a fine ship, isn't she?" Letty smiled and nodded. "Third hand, for now," he said proudly. "I'll get mate soon enough, then I'll sit for my skipper's ticket, my certificate of proficiency," he explained for her benefit. There were so many things she didn't know, a hierarchy of crew, for one. But did it matter that she was of the land and he of the sea? If they loved each other, They stood quietly, watching men run nimbly up and down ladders, boxes under their arms, bags across their backs. Alec stood taller, tilted his chin, his jaw set. One day, it will be my trawlers going out to sea. A fleet. She didn't doubt him. He was so full of life and vigour that at times she felt she could almost touch the energy that emanated from him. Alec was different from the boys she knew in the village, her brother's friends, the lads who worked summers at the farm, and, if she was truthful, it felt a little dangerous being with him. He led her towards the lock gates, where the ships readied themselves to leave, while out in the estuary more waited to enter. He pointed to the left. Across the water, that's Hull, and out there, he pointed to the right, is the North Sea and the way to the fish. There are fortunes to be made, and I don't see why we shouldn't have our share. She must have looked doubtful, but noticing, he said, "We'll be all right, lad." Would they? He was going away, and this time further than he'd ever been, to the frozen waters off the coast of Russia and Iceland, for 3 weeks, maybe more. She would be alone with Dorcas, and the thought made her shiver. "Your mother thinks I won't take to this life." He looked down at her. "She's worried for you. It's a different life to what you've known." Letty got the feeling that she would never suit Dorcas' notions of what a good wife was. "It's a different life for us all, isn't it?" she answered. He put his arm about her, and they watched the lock gates push back and the boats prepare to leave. Plumes of black smoke drifted about them, and it caught at her throat and made her eyes smart. She took out her handkerchief to dab at her eyes, and he mistook them for tears. "Hey, don't cry. I know Mother can be sharp, but she's grieving. She's angry at the world, not you. Angry at the sea that took her men." Letty wanted to weep then, for the dread of losing Alec stirred again in her stomach. The great Titanic had been lost in the days before their wedding, turning the conversation from joy to one of shock. Fear had taken hold then, for if a great unsinkable liner, pride of the White Star Line, could be swallowed by the deep, what chance did a small crew have in a trawler? Alec's voice was gentle. "It's hard for her. We've got each other." She gave him a reassuring smile, wanting to force her dark thoughts away, and he took her hand. They turned their backs to the sea and headed back the way they had come. On Pollitt Street, Alec stopped to admire the terrace of 3-story houses. Railway built them years ago to attract captains and trawler owners. He gazed at the top windows, twisted to check the view they would have of the docks, grinned at her, his blue eyes twinkling. "Aye, they attract me. What do you say?" Letty stared at them, imagining the rooms, the space inside. "Fine they are, but not for me." She didn't mind where they were for now. As Alec had said, it was a starting place. She tucked herself close, held on to his arm. "One day, I want a house with a bit of land so I can have my hens and pigs and we can have our own little piece of Lowestoft again. But look, how much room there is, lad. We could fit 10 of what we've got now in that one. You can get closer to the docks. I'd make sure you had help, a maid or 2. She laughed, and he became serious. He looked again at the houses, the large, solid front door. "I'd be home, off the ship with a hop and a skip." She nodded, trying to ignore the unease that stirred within her. Was what they wanted so far apart? They'd moved here for a better future, but they'd not discussed the finer details, only that they wanted to be together, and she wanted more than anything to bear his child, to have part of him always. Always. Suddenly, she knew that that was what Dorcas saw when she looked at him. Her son, a part of all she had lost. Letty smiled then, loving him, and he lifted her off her feet and swung her round, and she held on to her hat for fear it would blow away. "You'll have your land, our Letty, just as I'll have my ship, for I'll perhaps spend more time on that than at home." She tensed at this last remark, and he put her down gently. She took hold of his hand, gripping it more tightly than she'd done before. He faced her, people passing them by, looked into her eyes, and she saw her love reflected in his. He touched her face, and she tilted her cheek to his hand. "You shall have your heart's desire, my darling." She placed her hand upon his, took it from her face and kissed his palm, his skin rough and scarred from years at sea. "I already have it." It was the truth. But would it be enough? Chapter 2. Letty and Alex stopped to buy fish and chips to take home, and found Dorcas in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She brushed a strand of hair from her face with the back of her hand, so that they saw the scrubbing brush she held. A patch had been scrubbed clean on one wall, large enough to look like Dorcas had used much effort, Letty thought wryly. Alec put the parcel of food on the table, took off his cap, and stuck it on the chair post. "What you doing, Mother? I thought you and Letty was going to do that when I'm gone." "I couldn't sit idle," she sighed with irritation. "I won't be able to sleep in this filthy pit." Letty slipped off her coat and hat and hung them up on the pegs behind the kitchen door. She did the same with Alex when he handed it over and turned back to her mother-in-law. "We'll soon get it shipshape," she said brightly. "What would you know about shipshape?" Dorcas sneered. Letty felt herself shrink. Alec stepped in to soften his mother's raw edges. "Now, ma'am, let's eat, shall we?" He pulled out a chair and made her sit down, did the same for Letty, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze to reassure her. It was Dorcas's grief, wasn't it? It wasn't her fault. Dorcas took her place, her jaw set as she unwrapped the parcel. Alec pushed fish Letty's way, but she'd lost her appetite. After they'd eaten, Letty cleared the paper and wiped down the table, while Dorcas picked up her knitting and went to sit in the small front room with Alec. Letty joined them shortly after. That day they'd managed to scrub the floors upstairs and down so the rugs could be laid, but the walls were bare of pictures, and what they had was stacked on the sideboard. On the mantel above the empty grate were framed photographs of Alec's father, Will, his brother, Robbie, another of the whole family, staring somberly into the camera, and one of Will and Dorcas's wedding. Tucked behind them was one of Alec and Letty's own wedding. Had Alec noticed? If he did, he didn't say. There was no room for Letty's family photos, which had been left by Dorcas in a small pile on the stairs. There were 2 fireside chairs, so Alec fetched a bentwood from the kitchen, set it beside him, and drew Letty in. He talked of his ship. "I'd like to have seen it," Dorcas said, peering over her knitting at Letty. "There'll be time tomorrow." Dorcas dropped her knitting onto her lap, stilled her needles. "I'll not see you off on sailing day, lad. What's come over you?" She looked pointedly at Letty, who felt her cheeks burn, and she looked up to the photos on the mantel. Anything to avoid Dorcas's accusing stare. Alec shrugged. "It's just a steam trawler when all's said and done." "Aye." She resumed her knitting, the needles clicking faster than the clock. "It's hardly the Stella Maris." Her voice took on a wistful tone, and she gazed into the middle distance. No, she was a beautiful boat. "She was, Mother, The best sailing smack in the harbour. They exchanged smiles. His voice was gentle, but when he spoke again, there was a firmness to his tone. But she belongs to yesterday, and we've got to be looking forward. Dorcas turned her attention to the photographs and stared at them for a long time. Letty thought she saw a tear drop onto her mother-in-law's cheek, and her heart tensed with compassion. To have lost her husband and her son so tragically didn't bear thinking about, and Letty didn't want to think about it, for her biggest fear was that she would lose Alec to the sea. She shivered. Alec reached out and clasped Letty's hand. It comforted. Dorcas went on with her knitting. The steady click of her needles caused Letty to close her eyes once or twice. She got to her feet. "I'll fill the jugs and be to bed." Alec stretched his arms above his head. "Aye, it's been a long day. I'll be up soon enough. I'll sit a while, just me and Mother." Letty nodded. Dorcas's silence spoke volumes. She fetched the plain porcelain water jugs from upstairs, went out into the courtyard to fill them at the pump, and took them with her as she went to bed, leaving one in Dorcas's room, taking the other to their own at the front of the house. Releasing her long brown hair from its pins, she brushed it through, got into her nightdress and into their bed, taking Alec's pillow and placing it on top of her own. As she settled, voices of mother and son rose up through the floorboards, and Dorcas's voice became sharper. "The lass has no idea. She can't braid, and she needs to earn her keep. It'll slow me down to teach her, and set her filling needles." It set Letty's teeth on edge. She had no intention of spending her days braiding fishing nets, and had told Alec as much, hoping he would tell his mother. It was clear that he hadn't. Was that down to timing or fear? Truth be told, Letty was a little afraid of her too, but when all was said and done, she was a farmer's daughter and a market trader. If she could sell cabbages and cauliflowers, she could sell anything, and what's more, she intended to. Alec wasn't the only one with ambition. She listened as Dorcas prattled on. "She's going to pine for you, moon about the place." Alec was dismissive. "Letty's not like that, Mother. She's a strong lass." The click of the needles again, then Dorcas louder this time. Was it on purpose? "Strong in the arm, maybe, but it's the heart that matters." "She loves me. That's all I need to know." Letty's heart swelled with love for him. Dorcas cut back. "Now she does. But can she wait? Will she be steadfast when you're away? When she's afraid? Who will she turn to? Not me, I can tell you that." Alec lowered his voice, and Letty leaned towards the open door. "She's not flighty, Mother. It's not about being flighty, it's about being lonely. There'll be plenty of other men about." He laughed, his voice louder, confident. "Now why would she look anywhere else when she's got a catch like me?" Dorcas tutted. "Don't you be so cocksure, my lad." "Well, she left her family behind. That's how much she loves me. I don't doubt it, and I never will." Letty felt close to tears at his defence of her. He knew what it had taken her to leave with him, how much it hurt her. She was aware that Alec had stood up and was walking about the room. "She's got her own mind, and that's what I love about her." He sighed loudly. "We're married. That's an end to it." His mother huffed. "'Twould be better you'd married Becky Drew. She was the lass for you, or any of them other lasses that fawned over you." "But Letty's the lass I wanted." "Aye, but not the lass you needed. That lass upstairs knows nought of the ways." "She'll learn. She's a clever lass." "Clever catching you." She paused. Poor, lovely Becky. What a beauty that girl was. You broke her heart." Alec did not respond. Dorcas said no more, but she had said enough. Letty heard Alec say he was coming upstairs to bed, and she replaced his pillow, ready for him to take his place beside her. The thought of being alone with Dorcas for the next 3 weeks chilled her. In her haste to be with Alec, she'd only thought of being with him. It was with cold resignation that she realized she had married his mother, too. Chapter 3. Alec sailed the following day, and Letty and Dorcas spent the remainder of the week erasing the grime left by the previous occupants of number 3 Mariners Row, along with the vermin that had taken full advantage of the neglect. Evicting them had no doubt been more challenging than the poor family who had been unable to afford the rent. That Friday morning, Letty gave the front window a final wipe and went into the kitchen. Dorcas indicated the fresh bowl of water in the sink with a nod of her head, and Letty plunged her hands into it, enjoying the warmth as it travelled up her arms before reaching for the soap, then drying her hands on the scrap of cloth that hung by a nail on the back door. She opened it to let in some fresh air and leaned against the frame. "A good end to the week," she said, trying to thaw Dorcas's frostiness. Her endeavours so far had come to naught. Dorcas was resolute in her irritation of her son's choice of wife. But Letty was stubborn too. It was only a matter of time, and they had plenty of that. Letty peered out into the yard. A bird flew against the window, startling her, and Dorcas shrieked, "Shut the door! It's bad luck to have a bird in the house." Letty bit the inside of her cheek. Superstitions had come thick and fast from the day Letty began walking out with Alec. She hadn't been able to see him off at the docks. She couldn't wash on the day he sailed, lest he be washed overboard. There seemed to be an endless number that Dorcas used to build a wall against misfortune. Letty closed the door. "The sisal for the nets will be delivered from Hawkins first thing Monday," Dorcas said with no preamble. "I've asked for more needles. You'll need your own. You can learn to fill them. When you're good enough, I'll teach you to braid. See what we can make of you," she said pointedly, as if Letty was a piece of cloth that needed mending. Well, Letty would decide what she made of herself. It was Dorcas's insistence that she learn to braid nets, as the other women did. But Letty was determined to get something else, and she knew from her visit to the docks with Alex that there was plenty of opportunity. Braiding would keep the wolf from the door, but it was poorly paid piecework. And why spend time learning when she could make more elsewhere? Not that she would give her reason to Dorcas. She would find work first, then tell her. Letty changed the subject. "Shall we leave for Hammond's early to collect Alec's pay? We can take a look about the town." Dorcas shook her head. "The yard needs a good swilling." Letty persevered. "Sally said there's a fine hardware shop on Freeman Street, and we can get our vegetables from the market on the way back. It will be as well to get to know the place better." She leaned into the small square of mirror that hung above the table and tidied her hair, removed her apron and rolled down her sleeves. "I've already said I won't go down the docks until my boy can take me. I'll wait." Dorcas had always collected the men's pay. As Alec's wife, it was now Letty's duty, but she thought of Alec and altered her tone. "It's a glorious day." Dorcas shot her a look, and Letty knew it wasn't worth pursuing. Perhaps 2 stubborn women in one house was a recipe for disaster. Dorcas picked up a pail. "You can get what we need from the market by yourself." In the courtyard, a neighbour was taking in her washing, and over by the long wall 2 boys were playing with an old tyre. The older kids would already have left for the fish dock races, as they were called, when the women and children went to stand in line for their man's weekly allotment, a sub-payment from the trawler companies in advance of wages while the men were at sea. Letty pulled the door closed behind her. 4-year-old Alfie was sitting on the step next door, his chin resting on his scabby knees. "All right, Alfie?" she asked kindly. He looked up. "Yes, ta, missus." She smiled. He was a sweet child with his sandy hair and freckles, his serious blue eyes. That he was on the doorstep meant only one thing, and she heard the sound of laughter and the creak of bed springs drift out from the open window above the door. Anita was entertaining. From the other side of the yard, Sally Penny called out to her, pulling her door shut and hurrying across. "Off for your man's pay?" She linked her arm through Letty's and leaned into her. "Your ma-in-law not coming?" Letty shook her head. Sally tilted her chin in reply, turned her attention to Alfie. "You'll get chilblains sitting on that coal step," she said cheerfully. "Why don't you go over to play with the lads?" Alfie shook his head. "Mum told me to stay on the step and not move or she'd tan me backside." "I know someone else who wants their backside tanning," she said under her breath. The door of number 2 opened, and a pinched-faced woman came out and shook a tea towel, looked Letty up and down. "All right, Bet?" Sally asked. The woman huffed and shut the door. Sally shrugged, steered Letty out of the courtyard by her elbow. "Bet Chapman. She's a nasty old sod, but she'll back down if you stand up to her. Their kiddies are all grown." She sneered. "Can't say a good word about any of them, but there you go. It takes all sorts." Letty asked about Anita. "Poor lass. She's had her share of heartache." Sally shook her head. "A pitiful life for one so young, but she loves that little lad. What she does for him." They crossed over the long railway bridge and made their way to Freeman Street, Sally pointing out various shops as they walked in the direction of the docks. A lad stood on the street corner calling out, a sheaf of newspapers over his arm, his fingers and face dirty with print. Letty read the headlines on the boards propped by the lamp-post. "Trawler wrecked off Norwegian coast. 12 feared lost." Sally gave it a cursory glance. "Did you say you with Hammonds?" "Yes. Are they a good company?" "Not bad. My Bob's with Ericsson's. Been with them a good few years. Your man'll get to know what's what by and by." The roads around the docks were busy with people and traffic, carts and bicycles, wagons and trucks. Trains clattered past them, taking fish one way, coal another. Presently, Sally pointed to a building across the road. "That's Hammond's, up them stairs there." Letty saw the lettered sign above the doorframe. "Thanks, Sally." The older woman smiled. "Ta-ra, ducky." Letty watched her bustle over the road, calling out and acknowledging others as she went, before she was swallowed within the mass of humanity. Letty got into line and waited as the queue crawled forward and up the stairs to the first-floor office. The man in front of her was dressed in his suit, shiny at the elbows, his hair a mass of unruly curls escaping from beneath his tweed cap. His cheeks were ruddy, and he looked a jovial sort as he leaned against the wall. People tucked themselves into the sides as those already paid made their way down the cramped stairs. Behind her, a woman soothed a troublesome baby, and Letty turned and offered a smile. The baby gurgled. People chattered. A boy of about 9 skipped downstairs, thrusting the brown envelope deep into his pocket and keeping his hand there. The queue moved forward. It was hot and stuffy with so many people crammed in such a small place, and Letty wished she hadn't worn her jacket, but there was not room to remove it. She'd wanted to make a good first impression, for Alec's sake as well as her own. if she was to be noticed, it would be for all the right reasons. She dabbed at her neck with her handkerchief, looked along the high windows at the top of the stairs to check if any were open. They weren't. The queue moved again, and she was glad to find herself in the small office where the bald-headed cashier sat behind a dark wood counter, an open ledger before him. A large tin drawer to the side contained the pay packets, towers of silver and copper coins beside it. A younger man sat next to him, cross-checking the money that was handed over. The cashier spoke to the man in front of Letty. "Name?" "As if you don't know it, Perkins." He sounded tired, surly. The man behind the desk asked again, seemingly taking pleasure from irritating him. "Name?" "Stevens, Walter. Name of ship, Golden Harvest." Perkins ran a slow finger down the columns. The man brought his shoulders back. The air tingled with tension. Perkins turned a page, smirked, pushed his glasses onto his shiny bald head. "Ah, yes." He reached across to the coins. "Not the Golden Harvest you expected." He smiled at his joke. "A princely sixpence." He picked up a coin, but before he could hand it over, Walter Stevens reached across and took hold of Perkins' shirt, dragging him over the counter. The man's glasses went awry, and there was a gasp and commotion on the stairs as people crushed forward to see what was going on. Sweat was beading on Perkins's forehead, his face growing puce, the younger man trying to pull him back. The fisherman raised his fist. "I'll teach you to smirk at me, you bastard. 3 weeks at sea for sixpence, and you sat on your arse while I'm hauling nets day and night." Letty stepped forward and grabbed hold of him, feeling the strained muscles of his arm. "Don't," she said quietly into his ear. "Don't give him the satisfaction." Her heart was hammering in her chest. What if he turned his anger on her? There was little room. If he lashed out, she would get hurt. The baby began to cry, and the mother jiggled it up and down to soothe it. The man let his arm drop, and Letty felt the tension ebb from him. He turned to her and nodded, then gave his attention to the mother. "Sorry, missus, if I upset the babby." The woman shook her head. "It's all right, Walter. Better trip next time, eh?" "Aye," he said. Behind the counter, Perkins was adjusting his shirt. Walter snatched the silver sixpenny piece and pushed it into the baby's hand, forcing himself through the silent crowd and down the stairs. Perkins regained his composure as Letty stepped forward, her cheeks burning with anger. He'd taken satisfaction in humiliating Walter Stevens. Would he do that to Alec? Humiliate him? She could feel the sweat trickling down her back, her forehead. Perkins cleared his throat. "I beg your pardon, miss." Letty waited while he rearranged his shirt, moved the ledger so that it was square onto him. "Name?" "Hardy," Letty said. "Black Prince." The man quickly ran his finger down the columns and found the name. The speed in which he did so made her stomach turn. "Alec Hardy?" She nodded. Perkins counted her money, smiled. It sickened her. "I do apologise for the outburst." She leaned forward. "Perhaps he has a right to be angry," she said, irritated by the injustice. "Did you consider that? He's been away from his family for weeks, worked day and night in heavy seas, risked his life, and that's his reward. Perhaps you too would be aggrieved." He sat up sharply then, and she noticed his ears redden. Big ears they were too. The young lad at his side bit his lip to suppress his amusement. She caught his eye and mellowed a little, turned her attention back to Perkins, and added sweetly, "In the same circumstances, of course." She could hear the murmurings of those behind her, She hadn't wanted to cause a scene, but she couldn't help herself. Perkins handed over the money without another word, and she purposely made a show of checking it was correct. From the corner of her eye, she could see him bristle with indignation, and it gave her a small frisson of satisfaction. That man wouldn't last 3 minutes on board a trawler, she was sure of that. She placed the money inside her bag and turned to leave. The woman with the child touched her shoulder. "Here, lass, catch up with Walter and give him his 6pence. Happen he'll regret his generosity in an hour or two when he fancies a pint." She pressed the coin into Letty's hand and whispered, "Good for you. Putting that oik in his place." Letty didn't look back. Perhaps she too would regret her actions in an hour or two. She hurried down the stairs and out onto the pavement, waited for a moment while her eyes adjusted to the light. Standing on her toes, she peered out above the people who spilled past her, left and right across the road, decided to turn towards the town, weaving through the crowd, searching for Walter Stevens. It didn't take long to find him. His curly hair, the bagginess of his suit. He was talking to another man who handed him a cigarette and struck a match. He leaned in to take the light, drew on his cigarette, puffed out the smoke. Letty waited. He looked at her and frowned. Then recognition dawned. He put the cigarette to the side of his mouth, held up his hands. "I owe you an apology, missus." Letty stopped him. "You owe me nothing. I'd have done the same myself if he'd smirked at me like that." The older man turned to talk to a boy who had pulled at his sleeve, and Letty discreetly pressed the coin into Walter's hand. "I was told to return it to you." He looked down at the 6pence, and she saw the disappointment sweep across his weather-beaten face. "Thanks, lass. Too quick to lose my temper. Doubt I'll ever learn, but that sarky—" He smiled. "Thanks," he said again. He walked off, and she felt dread drag at her stomach. 6pence. How could he bear it? It could happen to Alec. The skipper and mate were share fishermen. They took a basic wage and a share of the profits, if there were any to be had. It could be famine or feast, and Letty knew that if a ship missed the best market prices, the men could land in debt to the owners. The enormity of their situation bore down on her, and she couldn't move. Carts clattered past, trains rattled in the distance, and ships' hooters screamed out from the dock basin. Suddenly she was overwhelmed by the noise of it all, the smell. She longed to be back with her family, to smell the clean, fresh air of the countryside, to run through the fields and shelter under the outstretched branches of the oaks and beech trees. Could they make a success of it here? It was all well and good talking it over with Alec. When he was with her, she was strong. She pulled herself taller. Self-pity would never do. "He's not a bad un, our Walter." She turned to see the woman with the baby, trying to get himself back together again. Letty reached out and touched the child's hand, shook it gently up and down and cooed to it. "I gave him the coin." "Aye, I saw you. I knew you would." The woman moved the child into her other arm and held out her hand. "Ivy Major. My hubby's on the Black Prince as well. Engineer." Letty took the woman's hand and introduced herself. They began to walk back towards the town, men stepping off the pavement and into the road to let them pass. Children were still leaning against the wall, waiting for their fathers and brothers, women waiting for husbands and sons. Letty longed for Alec to be home. What if he came back to 6pence? Or worse? The incident at the office had rattled her. "Is the Black Prince a good ship, Ivy?" The older woman smiled kindly at her. "Fair enough. Len has no complaints. He's been with Hammonds a while." She stopped, pressed her hand to Letty's arm. They're all much of a muchness. It's down to the skipper in the end. A bad skipper makes a bad ship, no matter who he's with. The baby pulled at her hat, and she released its fingers, smiled at Letty. Best not to fret, lass. Your man'll do all right on the Prince. Sam Harris is a fine skipper, and he does well. Looks after his crew, as well as his ship. He'll not be out of pocket. What is he? Decky? Third hand, but he already has his mate's ticket. Alec had been glad to get any work when they arrived, knowing he could work his way up once they got settled, and he could read and write, which was an asset, for many a good fisherman had been cast aside once certification became necessary as proof of competence. He's going to put in for his skipper's ticket when he can. Ivy nodded approvingly. Good for him. A young man as wants to get on. I'll have a word with Len when they land. He'll see him right. But Hammond's is a good firm. He could have done worse, she added, giving Letty another reassuring smile. Letty returned it, but it didn't make her feel any less worried. What good was the best skipper and the best boat if the weather was bad, if the fish were not to be found? She could see why the women took to braiding, but it wasn't for her. They stopped as the crossing gates were pushed across in front of them and waited for the train to pass, its many wagons taking fish all over the country, faster and further. As the last one disappeared down the line and the gates swung open, the two women crossed to safety and parted, Letty's thoughts tumbling. She'd put her faith in Alec, but what control did he have over the might of the sea, the vagaries of the market? Dorcas's misgivings had been well-founded. Maybe Alec would have been better marrying a girl who knew the ways of fishing families. But he had married her, and she would prove Dorcas wrong. Chapter 4. Sally was right about the market. Letty had filled her string bags with potatoes, carrots, onions, and a cabbage, and at a good price. From the butcher, she'd bought an oxtail and beef bones. She was tired, and her arms ached, but she was pleased with her efforts, not only for the food, but the information she'd gathered. Walter Stevens's predicament had frightened her to begin with, but now she was fired up to succeed. She had to do what she could while Alec was at sea. Their success as a family depended upon it. The courtyard was quiet when she returned, the washing taken in. Smells of cooking drifted from open windows and doors and mingled with the smell of horse dung from the stables. She was surprised to see Alfie still on the doorstep. "Surely you haven't been there the whole afternoon, Alfie?" Before he could answer, the door opened and a tall man with red hair forced his way past the boy. "And what's it to do with you?" he snarled, squaring up to her. "One thing I can't abide, it's interfering women." Anita appeared, laid her hand to her son's shoulder. "Away inside now, Alfie." The boy did as he was told. Anita folded her arms, leaned against the doorframe. Letty saw Dorcas twitch at the curtain. "Don't be so miserable, Baxter." He didn't comment, and Letty wasn't sure she wanted him to. His hair made him distinctive, his manner more so. Did he have the temper to go with that fiery hair of his? He pulled on his cap, glaring at Letty, and then turned to Anita. "Look after yourself, Neat, and the lad." He pressed something into her hand, turned on his heel, and swaggered out into the street. Letty adjusted the bags, the handles cutting into her fingers. "I didn't mean to cause you any trouble." Anita laughed. "You haven't. Take no notice of him. His bark's worse than his bite, like most blokes." She nodded at Letty's bags. "You found everything all right, then?" Letty put down a bag, and opened the door to number 3. "Enough to be going on with?" Alfie called out, and Anita went inside. Letty set her bags down on the kitchen table and began unpacking her bounty. Dorcas took the butcher's parcel from her and unwrapped it, dropping the bones into a pan of water she had set on the stove earlier. Letty took Alec's pay from her purse and brought down 2 of the 3 tins from the shelf above the range, 1 for the rent, another for food and coal, and 1 for savings. One of them would be empty for a while yet. She felt awkward dealing with the money. It was something else she'd taken away from Dorcas, but there was nothing she could do about it. She pushed the lids down on the tins and put them back. "You should have come with me. You would have enjoyed it." Letty could sense that Dorcas was agitated as the older woman moved about the kitchen, putting the vegetables in a basket on the shelves that ran top to bottom of one wall. She rummaged around in a drawer and took out a small knife. "It's not right, living next door to that hussy and hearing all those goings-on." Dorcas wiggled the knife towards the party wall. "And that little lad sat on that step the whole time you were gone." Letty removed her jacket and hat and hung them up, taking her time so she didn't have to look at Dorcas's miserable face. Dorcas began peeling the potatoes. The smell of boiling beef bones filled the air, and the windows soon clouded with steam. Letty was about to open the door, but remembering the bird, thought better of it. She put on her apron. "I quite like Anita. I found her nice enough. She's on her own, doing what she can to look after her boy. And if what she can is, well..." She paused, searching for words that wouldn't inflame. "What would we do if we found ourselves in the same position?" "Not that," Dorcas spat. "Never. I wouldn't." She bristled, attacking the potatoes with vigour. But who knew what lengths a woman would go to protect her child? Anita must love the boy with every breath in her body to go so far. The workhouse was full of children whose entrance into the world had been beyond their mother's care, abandoned on the highways and byways, left on doorsteps in the hope that someone would take care of them. They were the lucky ones, if you could call it lucky. Sinful, it is. Sinful. "Are you there?" Anita called out. Dorcas froze. Letty turned to go to the door, but the young woman was already in the room. Had she heard? She carried a parcel wrapped in newspaper and held it out to Dorcas. "Baxter brung me some fish. Me and our Alfie can't eat it. There's too much. It'll do for your tea." She was gabbling. It gave her away. She'd heard right enough. Letty scowled at Dorcas, who made no attempt to take the fish from her. Anita offered it again. "It'll only go to waste." Letty stepped forward. "That's so kind of you." She took the parcel and unwrapped it. 4 pieces of best haddock and a fillet of plaice. "Why, Anita, this is wonderful." She could barely contain her irritation with Dorcas, and eating in silence one more day was more than she could stand. "You and Alfie must stay for your tea. The broth will keep, and we've plenty of potatoes. It will take only a minute to peel a couple more." Anita glanced at Dorcas, her cheeks reddening. "Oh, I didn't bring it for that." "We know you didn't, but it would be mean-spirited on our part if we didn't offer to share it." Letty was barely able to contain her contempt of her mother-in-law, hoping her words had galvanised Dorcas to apologise for her behaviour. Yet it was Anita who was gracious. "That's right kind of you both." She glanced about the kitchen, taking in the 2 chairs. "Shall I nip back and get a chair and a stool for Alfie?" Letty took the large plate from the shelf and laid the fish on it. "That will be perfect." Anita's delight was obvious, and Letty was glad she had made someone happy, but try as she might, she didn't have that effect on Dorcas. When Anita left, Dorcas slapped her drying cloth down on the table and exploded. "How dare you invite that woman into my household?" Letty bit back her words, then corrected her. "Our household," she said firmly. It was her home, hers and Alec.